Good morning. I'm David Plazas, the Opinion and Engagement Editor for the Tennessean. We have the honor of having Mayor David Briley here today to talk to the editorial board, including Maria DeBarine, our executive editor, about his campaign for re-election for mayor of Nashville-Davidson County. This is part of a public service that we've been doing all week to get you acquainted with mayoral and at-large Metro Council candidates. Mayor Briley, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here this morning.
Thank you very much. And tell us a little bit about why do you want to continue in this position? Why are you running for re-election?
Sure. So the last 16 months almost, I guess this week will mark 16 months, have been eventful for the city. I believe that we were at a moment of crisis resulting from my predecessor's resignation. And during the last 16 months, I've moved the city forward. At the same time, focusing on the things that are important to the city: affordable housing, public education, occasionally scooters, things like that, just trying to move the city forward. And I think I've demonstrated that I'm the best qualified person in Nashville to move this city forward and focus on those real needs, the real challenges that the city has. And so it's an honor to represent your hometown, and I'd like to continue that for the next 4 years.
Thank you.
Talk to us a little bit about your qualifications and why it makes you a stronger candidate than your opponents.
Sure. So first, I have experience doing the job. I think I came into the mayor's office at a moment where there was a lot going on. We had issues that needed to be confronted, and I showed a steady hand and moved the city forward and continued to bring jobs to town. More than 10,000 or close to 10,000 jobs that we've announced. We had a budget shortfall that I helped the city manage through. And we continue to make progress. So I'm not going to be criticizing the other candidates as much as saying that I think it's pretty clear that if you look at the kind of characteristics we need in a mayor right now, somebody who knows the city, knows Metro, has experience leading the city, and has compassion for folks in town who are not getting to move along at the same pace as the rest of the city, I think I'm clearly the best candidate right now.
At the debate that we had at Belmont University, you said something that really perked my ears up. You called the failed Berry Transit Plan back last year. This was the May 1st referendum. Could you give us a sense of the extent of the challenge that you had when you took over as mayor? Because in your campaign last year, you talked about moving forward, but sometimes it's healing for people to understand what was the extent of the crisis, what did you have facing you, and why was it so difficult?
Well, so starting with the circumstances of my becoming mayor, we'd never had a mayor resign before. And we had a mayor resign under circumstances that were very unfortunate for the city. And I think it's fair to say she was beloved. And so for the city to lose somebody who was beloved and under those circumstances was heart-wrenching and disappointing to a lot of folks. So just from the sense of the community, we were not together. We were suffering. And then on top of that, I learned within just a few days of becoming mayor that the budget that I would have to consider in the coming weeks was going to be probably the most difficult budget the city had had in decades, frankly. Difficult not just because we were down on revenue, but difficult because we had 27 cranes up, and I knew people would struggle to understand how we could be short of money in that moment. And so I knew it would be difficult. And then on top of that, I think my leaving the Metro Council created some sense of not disarray, but unsettled nature there, just because everybody sort of expects things to go in a particular way, and then all of a sudden that was not the lay of the land. And then at the same time, we had all kinds of opportunities that we needed to follow through on. We had soccer, which hadn't been completed yet. We had job opportunities coming to town. We had a real crisis with the director of schools. So I have had, I think, very few weeks where I wasn't looking at circumstances that were critical to the city. And I think I've maintained an even keel and found a way for the city to move forward to the greatest extent possible during those moments. I've never complained about it. I've never pointed fingers at the prior administration and said, well, it's somebody else's fault. people want me to move us forward, and that's what I've worked on.
If you win in August, what are your top 2 or 3 priorities for the next year?
Well, when I win, because I'm confident I will be reelected mayor, I think our city knows what the primary 3 or 4 things are that we've got to work on. I can't really limit it to 2, frankly, but public education is something that is critical for us to make progress on. Right now we have a very low reading proficiency in 3rd grade, in the 20%, 27%, and we know that's just sends those young people off in a bad direction. So we've got to get a comprehensive plan that is funded and makes sense and is going to see progress in that regard in the very near future. So I'm going to work hard on that. We have, I announced Under One Roof 2029, the city's most comprehensive, nationally acclaimed affordable housing program, and we've got a lot of work to do there. I know it's not all we need to do on affordable housing, but I know it is the most important, the biggest first step our city has ever taken, and so I will continue to work on that. And then there's transit and transportation. We've got to see progress there. And so we've been working on 4 things. I'll be glad to come back and circle back and talk to those. We got to build something. I mean, I think we've planned enough, we've talked enough. Let's get something built, and that's what I'm working on. And then I think we have got to do a little bit more in terms of workforce development. Our system is a little bit disjointed, discombobulated. Other cities have pulled it together more concretely so that we can help folks who are trying to get these good jobs coming to town, help them be more ready for them. So those are the 4 things I think we really fundamentally have got to be focused on.
Because of the difficult budget years that you've faced, some of the criticism you've received has been how the budget has been put together, whether it's through one-time property sales or this year through a parking solution that the Metro Council has not yet approved because you tabled that.
Sure.
How do you explain that to voters? I mean, who may ask, where is this money? How do you make ends meet by the end of the fiscal year?
Sure. So virtually every budget the Metro Council has ever adopted has had some sort of one-term money in it. And so the 2017 budget that Councilman Cooper sponsored as Budget and Finance Chair had some money in there. My first budget did, and this budget does as well. What we do is we work through the budget, and we make sure that as the year is going along, we make progress on every single issue, including the sale of properties where that's necessary, although there's not any in this budget. We push forward on the issues that are necessary for us to get the things like the parking modernization done and the sale of our DES system. And so it happens every single year and is something we always work through. I think people have focused on it right now just because we've been tight and because the politics of the season are a little bit intense. Just for an example, last year's budget, we put 3 properties in to be sold. In fact, only one of them ended up being sold because we worked around and found other ways to go ahead and, I'm sorry, 2 of them did end up being sold, but we found a way to find money for the rest of it. Last year's budget had $15 million in it for parking. We didn't do the parking thing last year. We can manage our way through those circumstances.
Let's go back to schools. You touched on it as one of the 4 key components that you really want to emphasize in the next year. If we go back to 3 months ago, it seemed like there was a concerted effort to have a little more input on what was happening with the school board, what was happening with the district leader. Now we have someone in place for 2 years. We've got an election next August. Talk to us a little bit about what you would like to see happen with the school board and with the new leader.
Well, for starters, we do have a memorandum of understanding that we have essentially worked out that'll be in front of the Board of Education at some point in time, which I think is a good step forward in terms of the mayor's heightened involvement in public education in Nashville, which I think is needed. So we're trying to make progress on things like pay and managing their HR departments, some very specific things. I would love to see Dr. Battle there in 10 or 20 years as the director. That would be an indication she'd done a good job. It would be an indication we were seeing progress, and so I would like to see that. I think she would acknowledge there's a lot of work to be done for her to demonstrate that that's the case. We're trying to be very supportive of her, and we are trying to get the school board to be more focused on student outcomes and less focused on their relationships with each other. And so I think the election next August will give the city a chance to lay down a marker about what we expect from members of the Board of Education, that we expect them to work closely together, we expect them to be professional, and we need the student outcomes to be the highest priority for the Board of Education.
So related to education, earlier this week you announced an increase in salary for teachers, 4.5% in total throughout the year. Could you explain how that process worked, the financing? Because it has to do something with, I think, with MDHA to financing.
Sure.
Help us understand how that works.
Sure. It's complicated, but let me see if I can do my best. The property taxes that are collected downtown get divided up amongst a bunch of different funds. One of those funds goes directly to the school's operating budget. But part of the money in that fund has to come back to MDHA to pay for TIF loans, right? And that is true for all of the money that goes to all of the different funds. It goes back to pay TIF loans. As it turns out, the money flowing to pay TIF loans in the Capitol Mall redevelopment district exceeds the annual mortgage, as you might put it, or debt service payment that is required. And it exceeds it by about $7.5 million a year. So this year, what we've said is, well, let's not pay down the principal an additional $7.5 million on those loans. Instead, let's let the school board use that $7.5 million for raises. We'll be able to do that again next year and every year until the loan is paid off, because property taxes collected there are not going to go down. And then ultimately, I think in 2026, the loan gets paid off entirely.
Thank you for that. And could you address a little bit about, I know that the timing was,
Sure.
was unfortunate because obviously it opened you up to criticism that this was election related. Could you address that, please?
Right. Well, we are in an election, but that doesn't mean I stopped working for people who live in Nashville, especially for teachers. So I just kept working. And the timing of it is in part due to the fact that the council created this TIF study committee that required the city to go back and look at how we do tax increment financing. That initiated a process where MDHA was looking at all of their accounts, and that's how the number got identified. And I wish it had been earlier. That would have been great. But once it was identified, I wasn't going to sit on my hands because there's an election going on when I could find a way to get an additional 1.5% into the pockets of our teachers without raising taxes.
Let's move to transportation.
Mm-hmm.
The referendum was not approved in 2018. What would you like to see happen? You talked about now it's time to build something. What would that be?
Sure. So we've been working on 4 things already. First is we need a regional solution. I think everybody knows that. So we have been working with TDOT to get a second regional line constructed because we have Music City Star, which already goes to Wilson County. The next one would be a line that goes out Dickerson Road, connects to 386 corridor, the Vietnam Vets corridor, out towards Gallatin. TDOT has some money through the Improve Act for the Sumner County part of it. We think along Dickerson Road is the perfect place for us to add some transit, just because we can get out in front of the building before it happens, get our infrastructure in place. It's a place where people are already using transit, and it's a corridor that's going to see a lot of growth in the coming years, including jobs, as we saw with the announcement of the River North development recently. So it's the perfect place for us to go. So that's one good example of what I think we need to do. We need to get it out there. People need to see it. People need to know we can do it on time, on budget. People need to know that it will actually work. And then we can move on to the next things, which are things like a transit line from the airport to downtown. That's worked pretty well in other communities, and that could be the first spur of a line to Murfreesboro. That's essentially how that one would work. The third thing is that we've got to work better with TDOT to use our existing resources. Most people in Middle Tennessee are still going to be in cars for the foreseeable future. And so we're not using our resources very well. And we need better communication and signalization and monitors to manage that. And we're working with TDOT to get that done. Traffic demand management plays a role in that too. If we could figure out a way with better data to decide that these 5,000 people, if they just came to work half an hour earlier, the following intersections would lose 10% of their congestion. Those are the kinds of things you can do with traffic demand management. And then with WeGo, I think what we've got to do is they've pulled back a little bit from some of their routes. We've got to add frequency and duration going forward to those routes because that's what tends to build utilization of transit. Some of the routes that they've pulled back from right now were frankly pretty expensive. The bang for the buck was really low. And so I think we do all those things together, the MTA or WeGo improvements, Dickerson Road to Sumner County, something from the airport to downtown, and then better utilization of our current resources. We can focus on that right now without having another vote. We've got the resources where we can go get that kind of stuff done, and we've been working on that for a year.
Thank you.
You had mentioned River North, and when I read about that, I think this would be the first utilization of opportunity zones for Nashville. If you could correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the new Trump administration opportunity zones. How might that work in Nashville? How do you foresee that working in the future, especially given our affordability issues?
Well, I'm not sure that they're going to use opportunity zone financing. I know it's in an opportunity zone, but I'm not sure if they are. It's an important development in the context of our city because it is sort of opening up a new neighborhood where we can build a great new neighborhood without threatening an existing neighborhood with more density. So I think it's important for that reason. But I'm not confident they're using opportunity zone financing for that. They may have said that, but I'm not aware of that.
Affordable housing. So that has been a key issue for us through David Plaza's coverage, and it's obviously very important for the city. Can you tell us a little bit more in detail about your new plan and
Sure.
the future of it?
Sure. So if you look at the history of affordable housing in Nashville, I think in the history of the city, we have invested about $17 million of local money with MDHA, period, in 80 years. And so what I announced initially was $350 million over the next 10 years to be invested with MDHA to help them convert each and every one of their 6 developments into a mixed income neighborhood, because we know that concentrated poverty is not the greatest for success. And so we just announced last week the first $25 million, which is 140 units between Cheatham Place and Casey. And so it's going to add at least 1,000 units of that very affordable housing. The deeply affordable housing is the category they use. But overall, that is also going to add many, many more units that are not the deeply affordable. For example, at Cheatham Place, it's going to be 50 units of deeply affordable, 25 that are workforce, and then 25 that are market rate units. So that's a good example of the kind of thing we're going to be doing with the money that's going to MDHA. And I think it's important to invest in those communities because they are the communities that are the most rapidly gentrifying right now too in our community. So if we add units in those developments without displacing anybody, we're also going to give folks who live in those communities a chance to stay there and not get pushed out by development. I think that's critically important. The second part of it is the increased investment in the Barnes Fund. And so the example I love to give is Mending Hearts, where we've been investing money, where Mending Hearts is an organization that helps women coming out of prison with a felony conviction get their first housing. If you have a felony conviction in Nashville, it's difficult to rent, period. So they try and help bring those women back into community, and we're going to increase those investments by about 50% over the next 10 years. The private sector piece of it is critically important as well, and we are working with the private sector on a whole slew of different things to try and get them building more affordable housing in Nashville. One is working with for-profit developers to change the pilot structure here in Nashville, the payment in lieu of tax structure. Secondly is encouraging places like Vanderbilt to build more housing for their students that are currently living off campus. And then the third is we're working with local lenders and foundations to create what's called a real estate investment trust to go out and from a philanthropic perspective, help us build more housing in Nashville. I think one of the things the city has to appreciate about our housing issues is that we had a period of, I don't know, let's say 6 or 7 years during the recession where very little housing was built. And so we had a supply side issue that we're still trying to get past. And so I think we're going to, if we see, I know construction of new housing can seem like we're growing too fast, but we have to add housing in order to avoid that that problem that we've already experienced, where we don't have enough housing to meet the needs of the people who live here. And so those are the elements of that plan.
Thank you.
And I wanted to go back for just a few months to the, you recently created some new positions related to, I don't know if it's quality control, or at least it's looking at issues like the Colliers issue from last year. Could you talk a little bit about that and what the progress has been so far?
So I guess a little bit more than a year ago, I got my first notice of the Colliers issue and forwarded it on immediately to the auditor to look at, and gave notice to the state comptroller of this issue. And so once we realized the severity of the problem, I appointed the city's first chief compliance officer. Judge Cottrell is former Court of Appeals judge, former Metro legal director, and she's been looking hard at how we're doing that procurement, and there have been some changes made in the procurement process to avoid this happening going forward. We also put money in this year's budget to look at staffing at Public Works, because I think inherent in the Colliers issue was that we had let staffing get out of alignment, that we had outsourced too much of the typical Public Works staffing to a private contractor. And so the money we put in this year is going to help us get that realigned so these kind of things don't happen in the future.
I know the city has used incentives to either retain companies or bring companies here to Nashville. Some have been critical of some of the packages that have been offered. Can you share with us your viewpoint of incentives?
Sure. So, so far I have presented 2 incentive packages to the city council. I think all the candidates, or most of the candidates in the race, supported them or support them. And frankly, if they were prohibited around the country, that would be fine by me, but they're not. And so when it comes to companies relocating, we have to be competitive with other cities. And what we do is we are very thoughtful about how much we incentivize and how the numbers balance out. And we want to make sure that people in Nashville have an opportunity to earn a great living. We haven't done a single TIF investment since I've been mayor. That's not where we're headed right now. But I'm not going to turn my back on jobs because that's something we need to have in our community for people to be prosperous. Now, it's great that I think it was last week that we announced Pilot.com, a company from San Francisco, moving to Nashville, 450 jobs, and there's no local incentive required for that. And I think that will be more the case as time goes along.
You've occasionally asserted yourself in national debates, be it gun control issues for the weapons of war comment you made after the Waffle House shooting last year, and most recently this week related to the Trump administration deciding to take off the citizenship question off the upcoming census. Could you talk about how you balance that role as both the city leader and also someone who has a megaphone beyond the city?
Right. Well, I will say that is a harder issue. I like to stay focused on issues where I have a direct impact, where I'm actually making change. But just on the census question, what I would say about that is that Nashville's gone from being 2% to more than 12% foreign-born. And we have a lot of folks in our town who are in fear right now about the ICE raids and about the national climate on immigration. And so I felt it was important for me to speak up on that issue, to make sure that folks who live in Nashville know to the greatest extent possible, I'm trying to get their back on it. I'm trying to have their back and make sure that they're not, our city is not threatened by immigration policy on a national level.
So we talked quite a bit about Nashville's growth and the direction it's heading. Can you talk to us about how you want to see that sustained or slowed down? What is your viewpoint on how rapidly Nashville is growing?
Well, I think that the fundamental perspective on this has to be that we need to move forward. And it needs to be forward with a sense of compassion and interest and commitment to everybody who lives in Nashville. It's not really about getting bigger, it's about becoming stronger as a city. Now, adding additional construction to our town adds to the tax base, which gives us more resources to focus on things like workforce development and transportation and affordable housing and public education. So we have to have a balance in terms of how fast we grow, and are we growing at a rate where we can sustain it, where the benefits are felt by everyone, and where our neighborhoods are not threatened. And I think River North is a good example of that, where we can add residents to an area without having a negative impact on another part of town. And so that's the way I look at it. I think we've got a great planning director, and I think she's listening to communities and trying to find a good balance between growth and protecting our neighborhoods. And I think that's what's critically important to the city. Other cities around the country have tried to put up a no vacancy sign by stopping construction of infrastructure or limiting the number of housing units that can be built in their city. And what you see in those places is that people in the middle get pushed out. Places like San Francisco, where you can't buy anything for less than $1,000 a square foot. And that's not what we need to do here. We need to make sure that we are thoughtful about how we move forward, and we need to make sure we're taking care of everybody, but we can't pretend like we're not going to move forward.
As a quick follow-up, you have talked about wanting to have an equitable city and making sure that services and resources and opportunities are available to everyone. Can you spend a little bit of time on that?
Sure. I think that's important. One of the things I think I've heard a little bit in the context of this election is an attempt to divide downtown from the rest of the community and say too much gets spent downtown. And I think we're all in this together, and downtown is the economic engine for the city, and so I think we've got to be very careful about villainizing downtown. It's not the kind of city we are. But what it means is we've got to invest in open space all around the community, and so I announced 800 acres of new open space to acquire in Bells Bend. In the last capital spending plan, we invested in parks in Hermitage, and Donaldson Hermitage, and in Antioch, because those are communities that need more open space as well. And so I think folks need to stick together. We don't need to be divided about this. And the resources that are being generated downtown give us the capacity to invest in places all around the county and find a way to improve the quality of public education and streets and sidewalks. And that's the Nashville I know, where we do all come together, and I hope we stay that way.
Thank you.
There have been other cities across the country, including Minneapolis and Seattle, and most recently the state of Oregon, that have enacted a phasing out of single-family zoning only. Is this something that you might see as a good idea that you'd like to consider in Nashville? Obviously, there are issues about how do you create more density, how do you create more affordability. I don't know if you've given any thought to that particular issue of eliminating single-family zoning only.
I don't think we should eliminate it totally. I do think if you look around town and see areas where you have the R zoning, which allows for 1 or 2 family units, you see they're pretty successful. But I think you also see areas where the RS is pretty successful too. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at it comprehensively and sort of look neighborhood by neighborhood and decide if it made sense, because I'm not sure, for example, in a place like Westmead, which I think is primarily single family right now, that adding density there would be good for our transportation and transit infrastructure. I'm not sure that would make sense there. As you know, a lot of those neighborhoods were built with single family houses on lots of a large size because they were built before we had sewers. And so now they're all on sewer, so you technically could add more density there, but I'm not sure that makes sense. I think it probably makes more sense to add density along the corridors in and out of town initially to try and promote a better transit network.
There's a quick follow-up. There is a proposal that was tabled related to eliminating investor-owned short-term rentals from residential neighborhoods, but the discussion is still going. I understand that that was the most contentious issue of last night's Metro Council meeting. Right? What currently are you doing to address any concerns or complaints about short-term rentals? Has the situation gotten any better?
Well, I think the situation has stabilized a bit because we've the ordinance that's out there has been complemented by technology that allows us to identify the units that are not licensed that are out there being used. We also raised the fee this year to about $1,000 effective 2 days ago. And that's going to help us hire 2 new inspectors to go out on the short-term rentals to do more enforcement. And I think that will be helpful. We'll get those 1,000 or so onto the paying taxes at least. I did not know they had tabled it last night because I think there is some merit to what they're considering there because in neighborhoods like in particular Germantown, Salem Town, where you have a mixed zoning that allows for multifamily. I'm not sure adding a multifamily short-term rental building is a good thing for a neighborhood.
When you're out in the community campaigning and talking to residents and voters, what are the top 2 or 3 items they talk to you about that they want addressed?
I would say there is persistent confusion about the budget. I would say the transportation and transit, and then public safety, public education. Those sort of be the 4 top things that we hear about the most. That'd be my sense of it. That's a anecdotal assessment, not
Right.
polling driven.
Right.
You mentioned in one of the forums from last week, and they've all come together for me, at least in my mind. But
Not me. I can remember each one very specifically.
But you did say something that was that when you were asked about one of the biggest problems in the school system had to do with the resegregation
Right.
of public schools. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what can we do? You know, we have this national conversation about what went on in the busing situation back in the 1970s.
Right.
You know, we certainly have a long history since 1969 here in Nashville of how that occurred. What can we do about that?
Well, so just to lay the groundwork, you know, Nashville was under a consent decree, I think, or a court order for 20-something, more, almost 30 years, which ordered us to desegregate our schools through busing. And the federal court had oversight over how we drew the zones around each school. In the late 90s, that ended. And it came along with the construction of some new schools. Since then, housing patterns and other things have resulted in many of our schools becoming resegregated, where we have many schools in Nashville that are either exclusively or predominantly African American. And so I think that is not good for our city in many different respects. And so one of the things we can do is what we're doing with Under One Roof, where we're going in and making mixed income neighborhoods in these areas that were highly concentrated poverty. I think that is part of what we need to do. I think the board is going to have to take a hard look at some of the zones and try and figure out a way to get them reintegrated to a certain extent. Now there are good points there too. I mean, if you look at MLK or even Fogg and Overton in particular, and I don't mean to single any out, but if you look at some schools, you see they are still mixed race and doing well. But there are some hot spots where we've got to go take a deeper dive and get more resources to work to try and address that.
We have asked each of the candidates for their specific viewpoint on scooters. So I want to give you an opportunity to let our viewers know what you think about the scooters.
Sure. Scooters are really the third iteration of something, right? First was short-term rentals, or maybe first was rideshare, and then short-term rentals, and now a third platform that gets scaled up in our community, really without any local interaction before it comes. And so it's a lot of addressing scooters is about building up a better local regulatory scheme. I would like for them to come off the streets while we do that. I think the council, what they did initially is just a failed experiment. It has not worked correctly or well for the city. And that's what I hear from people downtown, especially people who work and live downtown. They really are upset about scooters. And I frankly have to say that I've heard from enough people who are either blind or use a wheelchair that they can't get around downtown, and that is, I think, frankly, unacceptable. And so I would like for them to come off the streets. We can work with the companies to try and come up with some regulatory scheme that works for our city under the circumstances we have.
I know one of the combination perhaps of success and a headache of this past year has been the NFL draft and the cherry trees juxtaposed with that. What lessons do you think you've learned from that experience, both the good, the bad, the ugly?
Well, I would say that I've learned a lot, or at least thought about it a lot. So social media has an intense effect on public debate. I think it does not promote civility generally, and I think we saw that happen quickly with this issue. So that's one part of it. I think there is a sense that of unease about the pace of growth in Nashville, and we've got to be more focused on making sure that everybody benefits from it and that everybody understands what the upsides and downsides to it are. And I think going forward, everybody needs to be more focused on that.
There are varying viewpoints of what should happen with the fairgrounds. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what you would like to see long-term with that property?
Well, right now we're in the midst of I guess, three things that are going on over there. First, we are pretty close to completing the new buildings for the flea market and for the event space over there. I think people are going to go look and say, okay, well, that's better than I thought it was going to be. That's actually okay. The second thing is making sure that we get the soccer stadium up and built in time for the first season, and so that is a lot of work. And then there is the issue of the state fair and just making sure that that they can be accommodated there in the long run. And we've reached out to, I guess, a nationally renowned expert on state fairs to help us look at the space over there to make sure that they can be accommodated in the long run. And we're willing to make some investments to see that that's the case going forward. And then I guess there is a fourth thing with the racetrack, but the racetrack is required by charter, so it's going to stay, and we'll see if the folks from North Carolina can come back with a proposal that lives within the current site and doesn't require any local money.
So for transparency's sake, just to let the viewers know that you and I ran into each other after your Honky Tonks summit at Kid Rock's Honky Tonk a few months ago. Mm-hmm. You had mentioned during the debate last week when you were asked about the places to see, you said Tootsie's.
I probably shouldn't have picked one.
A lot of questions from folks. Was he serious? Was he being facetious? What is your relationship with the Honky Tonks these days, and do you actively attend them?
I don't actively attend them. I go occasionally is what I would say about it. Well, clearly it is an important part of the city's economy, not just from the perspective of tax collections and property taxes in particular, but lots of people work down there, so it's something we need to make sure is thriving, and so that's why the police department announced just yesterday some additional police presence that's going to be downtown starting immediately, and you know, I would say I have a mixed relationship with them. Some of them love me and some of them tolerate me. I guess is how I would put it. It is an important part of the economy. It's been down there for a long time. I think it would be a mistake to do anything that threatened it.
We've talked about, I think, your 4 key priorities. Could you, if there's anything we haven't talked about regarding your values or the direction you want to see the city go or the type of legacy you would like to leave, could you share that with our viewers?
Sure. So I think the one thing that we haven't talked about a whole lot in the campaign is climate change, and so I think the city of Nashville has got to be more forward-leaning in terms of addressing that and thinking through the consequences of it. And so I think that's something in the next 4 years we'll work hard on. Whether there's not much we can do directly to deal with more frequent severe weather events, except to ensure around them, and add the new tornado sirens, which we've already done. But the downtown flooding, I think, is something we're going to have to circle back on and make a final decision about how we're going to address that. I think the plan generally seems okay. The financing of it is the thing we're going to have to go back and readdress. And I think we can do that so that it's not a burden on the taxpayer for us to get it done. But I think that's something we need to reassess. Because in February we came close to having a similar event downtown with the flooding back then. And so, one of the real risks of climate change is that there's a mass migration somewhere around the world in the next 30, 40 years, and all of a sudden our city changes pretty radically overnight. We ought to do everything we can to confront that. One thing that I think the city of Nashville can do, and what I intend to lead on, is working closer with TVA to get their power supply moving more towards renewables. I think we can do that by providing them with more demand. And I think so Nashville and Middle Tennessee, and in fact, I think the whole state should be a leader in terms of converting to electric vehicles, which would sustain the TVA grid, and it could happen in conjunction with them converting to renewables. So it could be a win-win, and so I think that's something our city ought to consider.
Just building on something you said earlier about downtown or the neighborhoods, some of the conversations that have been had are, why can't the neighborhoods get more of the revenue that's coming out of downtown? When people ask you that, what do you say? And can you do that? Can you increase that investment in things like storm infrastructure, crosswalks, et cetera?
Right. So one number that's sort of stuck in my mind is that property taxes in the 19th council district are $150 million a year approximately, far exceeding any other council district in the town by multiples. And so 100% of that money goes into the general fund, except for the little TIF, not 100%, almost 100%. There's some TIF money that's pulled out, but a tiny little amount. So $150 million going every year into the general fund to pay for things like teachers and sidewalks, and that will continue to be the case. The tourist development zone that some folks like to talk about is it's not that simple. I mean, we loaned money, or we borrowed money from bondholders all around the world, and the bond covenants, the contract says that money will only be used for tourism that gets collected in the tourist development zone. Now, we've done our best to get as much money out of the TDZ to pay for our costs associated with tourism, and we'll continue to do that. But downtown is a net generator of revenue for every single council district in town, and that is just the simple fact of the matter.
Well, at this time, we're heading to the conclusion of our interview. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we get to the concluding statements?
I don't think so.
Well, then let me give you the opportunity to talk to our viewers directly and let them know why you want their vote and how they can contact you if they want to learn more about your campaign. Sure.
So the last year has been a contentious year in the city in many respects. And I've worked, I think, very hard to demonstrate that I have the capacity and leadership, honest leadership, to move the city forward under these circumstances. We've confronted a difficult budget. We have made progress on housing and many other issues in the city during that time frame. Public education, pay raises for employees. We have made real progress. And you know, it's an honor, and not many people get to be the mayor of their hometown. And And so I consider it to be a great honor to have done it. And what I can tell the voters and everybody living in Nashville is that if they let me stay for another 4 years, I'll go to work every single day, working hard to make sure that as we move forward as a community, that everybody gets a chance to succeed. And I think I've demonstrated that's where my heart is in the last 16 months. That's where my heart and all my passion and all my energy will go for the next 4 years if I'm given the chance.
Very good. And how can people contact you if they want to learn more about you and your campaign?
Sure, you can go to davidbriley.com and check out the website there. Well, I think we're on Facebook and Twitter and everywhere else as well, Instagram, which is nicer.
Well, thank you, Mayor Briley. And to our viewers, we want to thank you very much for joining us today. You can replay this interview on Tennessean.com and also watch the other interviews that we have. The deadline for voter registration has passed, unfortunately, but we hope that you have registered and that you will go out to vote starting on July 12th, which is the start of early voting. August 1st is the last opportunity